Severance Season 2 just wrapped, and holy hell, what a ride it's been. From goat sacrifices to baby crib dismantling, we've witnessed the most unsettling corporate drama ever put to screen. But beneath the creepy animatronics and labyrinthine hallways lies the show's most devastating question. Is half a life even worth fighting for? Throughout horror history, the greats have each tapped into specific fears. Romero showed us mindless consumption in Dawn of the Dead, Cronenberg made us afraid of our own bodies in The Fly, Lynch made the familiar terrifying in Twin Peaks. But Dan Erickson's Severance achieved something I believe is even more philosophically challenging. It makes us question whether our consciousness, the very thing we consider us, is actually sacred or just another resource to be exploited. Now, I'm gonna make a bold claim. Severance is the most perfect existential horror ever created for television. Not because it's the scariest or most disturbing, but because it takes our most fundamental fear, the fragmentation of self, and builds an entire world around it that feels disturbingly plausible. And in the age of work-life balance and corporate wellness programs, Severance really hits home. And today, we're diving deep into exactly how Erickson pulled off this masterpiece of existential dread. The premise: divided consciousness in complete corporate hellscape. Before we dive into our topic for today, let's first set the stage. Severance presents us with a deceptively simple premise. Employees at a mysterious corporation called Lumen Industries undergo a surgical procedure that splits their brain into two, which, as we all know, are their work self, also known as the innie, and their life self, the outie. These two sides share zero memories. So once employees step into the elevator at Lumen, they become an entirely different person. One who only exists within the office walls and has no knowledge of the outside world. This concept initially feels like a clever metaphor for work-life balance, something we could all use a bit more of, right? But as Season 1 revealed, it's anything but. The innies essentially live as corporate prisoners, existing only to work on mysterious tasks they don't understand, with no agency over their own existence. They're born as adults on a conference room table, and they die whenever their outie decides to retire or quit. And what made Season 1 so compelling was watching Mark, Dylan, Irving, and eventually Helly discover the horror of their situation. And here's where we first see the true stroke of genius. While other sci-fi shows might treat consciousness division as a cool thought experiment, Severance treats it as the existential violation it truly is. In that respect, it's closer to Kafka's The Metamorphosis than Star Trek, a meditation on identity and existence disguised as a high-concept sci-fi. Season 2 takes this foundation and builds something even more disturbing on top of it. Or as Malcolm X, the American revolutionary, once said, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress." And nothing could better describe how Lumen handles the rebellion that ended Season 1. Which brings us to the illusion of victory, or gaslighting as a corporate strategy. So Season 2 opens right after the dramatic events of the Season 1 finale. Our innies just went through with a daring plan to temporarily wake up in their outside lives and reveal the truth about Lumen.
We're not happy. We're miserable.
Ellie discovered that she was actually Helena Egan, daughter of Lumen's CEO. And Mark was about to tell his sister that his supposedly dead wife Gemma was actually alive and working at Lumen as Miss Casey. So when Mark S. wakes up back at work, there is a moment of disorientation. He runs through Lumen's labyrinthine hallways searching for Miss Casey, only to find that her office has literally disappeared. This is the first hint that Lumen doesn't just gaslight its employees, it physically remodels reality to match its lies. And what follows is an absolute masterclass in how systems neutralize rebellion. Mr. Milchick, now promoted to floor director, greets our innies with congratulations. telling them they're famous whistleblowers for Severance reform. Lumen is committed to making life better here on the severed floor. "Congrats, we won," he says with that smile that never quite reaches his eyes. When you think about it, this scene seems ripped straight out of Orwell's 1984, where truth is whatever the party says it is. In the outside world, Lumen successfully managed the PR crisis. Helena Egan dismissed her innie's distress call as a joke, and Mark's revelation about his wife was written off as confused rambling. This gaslighting is existentially terrifying in a way that conventional horror can't really touch. In a slasher film, for instance, you know what you're afraid of: the killer with the knife. But in Severance, the characters can't even trust their own experiences. They're told their rebellion succeeded, while every bit of evidence suggests that nothing has changed. They're trapped in a reality where truth itself is manipulated. And sure, other shows like Black Mirror might explore horrifying technologies, but Severance does something even more insidious. It shows how easily institutions can rewrite history and reality itself. And that's a much more immediate, relevant horror than any technological dystopia. This gaslighting doesn't stop at denying their rebellion happened, however. Lumen then takes things a step further by introducing what they call improvements to the severed floor experience. Or, as I like to call them, longer leashes, deeper chains. As Season 2 progresses, Lumen's superficial reforms take the form of new privileges for our innies. For instance, Dylan G receives visitation rights with his Audi's wife, while Irving gets a hall pass to visit other departments. On the surface, these all seem like improvements, small freedoms within their confined existence, but as we follow these storylines, it becomes clear these privileges aren't kindnesses. They're just sophisticated methods of control. Dylan's visits with Gretchen start innocently enough, but gradually evolve into an intimate relationship that eventually crumbles when his Audi finds out. The privilege becomes a new avenue for pain as Dylan experiences love and heartbreak for the first time, emotions his fractured existence was never designed to handle. And similarly, Irving's hall pass leads not to freedom, but to a more complex prison. His search for Bert G and the mysterious dark hallway from his Audi's paintings just pulls him deeper into Lumen's labyrinth. So it's basically like giving a prisoner access to more cells in the same prison and calling it freedom. And this is exactly where Severance's existential horror really distinguishes itself yet again from predecessors like The Twilight Zone or The Prisoner. Those shows often presented obvious dystopias where the horror was in being trapped. But Severance understands that the truly insidious systems don't just trap you, they take it up a notch by making you complicit in your own imprisonment. How? By offering the illusion of choice and freedom, of course. As French philosopher Michel Foucault might observe, the most effective forms of control are those that make subjects police themselves. And Lumen's quote-unquote privileges are more than just longer leashes. They're ways to make the innies invest more deeply in a system that's designed to exploit them. But then, as Season 2 progresses, we soon discover an even more disturbing battleground being fought over. And that's the very identity of the innies themselves, when your worst enemy is yourself. One of Season 2's most brilliant slow burn plots revolves around Heliar, who we know from Season 1 is actually Helena Egan, aka the daughter of Lumen's CEO. When the innies share stories about what they saw in their outside lives during the rebellion, Ellie lies, claiming that she was just alone in her apartment. This immediately raises questions. Is she embarrassed about being an Egan, or is something else going on? As the season progresses, Irving grows increasingly suspicious of Helly's behavior, culminating in the shocking outdoor retreat episode. After an intimate moment between Mark and Helly in the wilderness, Irving confronts her and realizes the truth. This isn't Helly at all, but her Audi, Helena Egan, who has been spying on them all season. Now, this revelation is genuinely chilling on multiple levels. First, it means Helena has essentially been wearing her innie's body like a disguise. infiltrating their small community. And second, it means that the real Helly has been completely shut out of existence for weeks. It's like a form of possession or body snatching, but made more disturbing because it's technically Helena's body in the first place. The philosophical horror here runs even deeper than films like Get Out or The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, because we're not dealing with an external entity taken over. This is the rightful owner of the body suppressing a consciousness that she herself created. It's clear that Helena didn't create Helly as a PR stunt. She's now actively working to destroy her. When Irving attempts to drown Helena, believing she's an infiltrator, it leads to one of the season's most devastating consequences yet, with Irving's innie being terminated permanently. He was basically executed for defending his friend. The visual of his colleagues holding a funeral for him with his melon head bust is both absurd and profoundly sad, and it really shows just how disposable these consciousness fragments are as far as Lumen is concerned. This storyline forces us to question what happens when that continuity is deliberately fractured, and one fragment decides to eliminate the other. Personally, I think this is a form of suicide that only kills part of the self. But while Helena's infiltration reveals the personal horror of having your identity stolen by another version of yourself, what I think is truly the most jaw-dropping revelation of Season 2 comes when we finally discover what those mysterious numbers in MDR actually mean. Let's talk about industrializing consciousness. So now we're at that point where we finally learn what those mysterious numbers the macrodata refinement department has been sorting actually mean, and the revelation is more disturbing than anything we could have imagined. They're building new consciousnesses, specifically multiple severed personalities for Mark's wife, Gemma. Each file that Mark, Helly, Irving, and Dylan have been working on corresponds to a separate room in the basement levels, each containing a different severed version of Gemma. The mysterious Cold Harbor file that becomes so important in the season finale represents the most devastating trauma test, a room containing the baby crib that Mark and Gemma tried to build, which she must disassemble without emotional reaction. Now, this revelation transforms our understanding of the entire show. Lumen isn't simply separating work life from home life, they're industrializing consciousness itself, slicing it into dozens of separate fragments, each designed to compartmentalize different types of suffering. Dr. Mao explains they're testing the barrier that prevents trauma from one consciousness from bleeding into another. And when you think about it, the philosophical implications are staggering. Philosophers from Descartes to Chalmers have wrestled with the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience emerges from physical processes. Severance takes this abstract question and turns it into concrete horror. What if consciousness could be partitioned like a hard drive, with each partition unaware of the others? This makes Severance's existential horror far more sophisticated than even brilliant predecessors like Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, a film that explores erasing memories to avoid pain. Instead, Severance suggests creating entirely new beings whose sole purpose is to experience specific types of suffering so others don't have to. It's like a nightmare version of utility philosopher Peter Singer could never have imagined, maximizing happiness by creating disposable consciousnesses to handle all the unhappiness. And then, as Mark completes Cold Harbor in the finale, we see the full realization of this horrific experiment. Gemma enters the room and begins disassembling the crib with no emotional response, which is a success for Lumen's project, but a devastating indication of how thoroughly they've fragmented her selfhood. But beneath all this high-tech consciousness manipulation, Severance also knows when to get primal. It seems to be aware of how alienating sci-fi can get, and so the show's most viscerally disturbing moments come from ritual, blood, and sacrifice. The ritual in the void. One of Season 2's most bizarre and disturbing elements is the presence of goats in Lumen's facility. So after glimpsing someone nursing a baby goat in Season 1, Season 2 reveals an entire department dedicated to raising these animals, the Mammalians Nurturable, run by the enigmatic Lauren. And the purpose of these goats becomes horrifyingly clear in the finale, when Lauren brings one to be sacrificed as part of the Cold Harbor completion ritual. Drummond says,
"We commit this animal to Kier in his eternal war against pain."
revealing the quasi-religious nature of Lumen's work. This ritual sacrifice scene draws on ancient religious practices, where animals were killed to appease gods or mark significant events. But in Lumen's sterile corporate environment, these spiritual rituals feel grotesquely out of place, as if the company is attempting to fill the existential void created by Severance with manufactured meaning. The image of Lauren in her looming black outfit, the altar shaped like a swaddled baby, and the cold way with which they prepare to kill the goat evokes both religious ceremony and clinical medical procedure. It's as if Lumen is trying to sanctify its technological violations of consciousness by wrapping them in ritual. This combination of ancient ritual and futuristic technology recalls Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey, where humanity's most advanced achievements are framed against our primal nature. But Severance takes this juxtaposition even further, suggesting that our technological ability to fragment consciousness has outpaced our ethical framework for understanding what consciousness even is, and Lauren's reluctance to continue these sacrifices hints at the moral bankruptcy of Lumen's project. Even those involved in the system can sense its emptiness, yet they continue to participate. Another layer of existential horror as people become complicit in rituals they don't even believe in. Which brings me to my next point. Any truly great horror story knows that fear hits hardest when there's something worth protecting. And at its core, Severance understands that existential dread is most powerful when contrasted with genuine human connection. And nothing explores this tension more beautifully than the fractured love story that sits at the heart of Season 2. Let's take a look at that. Love across fractured selves. Throughout Season 2, we gradually learn the full story of Mark and Gemma's relationship through flashbacks. We see them meet, fall in love, and struggle with fertility issues. Relatable, right? This conventional love story becomes twisted when we discover that Gemma didn't actually die in the car accident as Mark believed. She was in fact taken by Lumen and subjected to multiple severance procedures. Mark Saudi then begins the slow, dangerous process of reintegration to access his innie's knowledge about Gemma. Meanwhile, we see Gemma subjected to Lumen's experiments, moving between various severed personalities in different rooms, each containing different forms of trauma or discomfort, like endlessly writing thank you cards or sitting in a dentist chair. The parallel journeys of Mark trying to become whole while Gemma is being further fragmented creates a fantastic tension. It's a love story where both participants are literally not themselves, and neither has access to the full range of experiences and memories that made their relationship what it was. This exploration of love across fractured selves offers something far more philosophically rich than conventional romantic dramas. While films like The Notebook might explore how love persists despite memory loss, Severance asks a more fundamental question. If the person you love is split into multiple consciousnesses, which version are you actually in love with? Season 2 culminates in Mark's rescue attempt, where he finds Gemma in the Cold Harbor room. When they leave the room together, they briefly reunite as their original selves in the elevator, a moment of genuine connection as Mark and Gemma rather than any Mark and severed Gemma. But as they reach the severed floor, they revert to Annie Mark and Miss Casey, suddenly confused about why they're kissing. This moment captures the existential tragedy that's basically Severance's whole heart. Even love, our most profound experience of connection, becomes fragmented and distorted in a world where consciousness itself can easily be divided. So if you're the type that thinks love conquers all, then is half a life even worth fighting for? The finale presents Mark with an impossible choice that perfectly encapsulates the show's existential themes. After guiding Gemma to the fire exit that will take her to freedom, Mark makes the shocking decision not to follow her. Instead, he returns to Heli, choosing to remain in Lumen with his any existence. This decision seems incomprehensible from an Audi perspective. Why would anyone choose to remain a prisoner when freedom is literally steps away? But from any Mark's perspective, escaping with Gemma means the end of his existence as he knows it. If he leaves and his Audi undergoes reintegration, any Mark would essentially die, subsumed into the larger consciousness of Audi Mark. So by choosing to stay with Heli, Mark is choosing his own version of existence, limited as it may be, over oblivion. It's the ultimate existential statement. Half a life is still a life worth fighting for, and thus the final image of Mark and Heli running hand in hand down Lumen's corridors with no plan and nowhere to go is both hopeful and tragic. They're asserting their right to exist even as their existence remains fundamentally constrained. It's like Camus' Sisyphus finding meaning in the endless pushing of the boulder, an affirmation of life in the face of absurdity. But what makes this ending so powerful is how it forces us to confront our assumptions about what makes a life valuable. As we all know, most horror stories end with escape or death. But Severance offers us a third option, choosing to remain within the nightmare because the alternative means ceasing to exist as yourself. No other horror series has so effectively captured the core of existential philosophy, the struggle to find meaning and assert identity in a world that denies both. Films like The Truman Show, for instance, explored the horror of discovering your reality is manufactured, sure, but Severance goes further by asking, what do you do when you know your reality is manufactured, but it's the only reality in which you exist? And soon enough, you realize that no one escapes the system. Running parallel to our Annie's story is a subtler but equally powerful narrative about Seth Milchick, Lumen's newly promoted floor director. Throughout Season 2, we witness Milchick's slow disillusionment with the corporate system he has faithfully served. When his supervisor, Mr. Drummond, gives him a terrible performance review for absurd reasons like using too many big words or, as the review puts it, an endearing element of his identity is his imaginative eloquence. Something breaks in Milchick. Despite years of perfect corporate citizenship, he discovers he'll never truly belong to the inner circle. His response,
"Devour feculence."
which I can translate right now for you, means eat shit.
It means eat shit, Mr. Drummond.
Marks his first real moment of rebellion, suggesting that even the enforcers of the system eventually recognize its fundamental injustice. What makes the storyline so effective is how it reverberates classic existentialist literature like Sartre's No Exit, where characters gradually realize their participation in systems that ultimately dehumanize them. Milchick's journey from perfect company man to disillusioned employee mirrors the awakening that many real-world workers experience after years of corporate loyalty. The brilliance of Severance is showing that existential horror corrupts just about everyone within the system, including those who seem to benefit from it. No one at Lumen, regardless of their position, escapes the fundamental alienation the company creates. And just when you think you've grasped what makes Severance so deeply unsettling, there's another layer lurking beneath the surface. The show's true mastery isn't in its premise or even its execution. It's something far more insidious that's been working on you since the very first episode. So, without further ado, let's move on to our final chapter, the architecture of existential dread. As Season 2 concludes with that haunting freeze frame of Mark and Heli running through Lumen's corridor, it's clear that Dan Erickson has created something unprecedented in television horror. While shows like Twin Peaks or The Twilight Zone certainly explored existential themes, Severance builds its entire narrative architecture around the most fundamental questions of existence. What makes us who we are? Can consciousness be divided without destroying personhood? If we're split into multiple selves, which self has the right to exist? Is a partial existence better than no existence at all? The genius of the show lies in how it makes abstract existential concepts concrete and emotionally resonant. We don't just think about the horror of divided consciousnesses, we feel it in Mark's impossible choice between Gemma and Helly, in Dylan's relationship with a woman who belongs to another version of himself, in Irving's funeral for a self that still exists somewhere. What elevates Severance above other existential narratives is its understanding that the most terrifying questions aren't about death or meaninglessness in the abstract. They're about the fragmentation of identity itself. Not will I die, but was I ever fully alive to begin with? And as we wait for Severance Season 3, we're left with that powerful image. Two people holding hands, running into uncertainty, fighting for their half-lives with everything they've got. It's both inspiring and devastating. The perfect encapsulation of existential philosophy itself, which recognizes both the absurdity of existence and the human impulse to create some form of meaning anyway. So, what do you think about Severance? Let me know in the comments, and also, don't forget to check out my other videos.